Well, Matthew Taylor, I'm honored to have you on the Beyond Sunday podcast, man. How are you today?
I am doing all right, and I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great to have you. Today's conversation is kind of based on this book I'm holding right now with Matthew wrote. Fantastic. The Violent Take It by Force, the Christian movement that is threatening our democracy. It's quite the title. And so I want to start here, man. The crux of your book is really the Capitol riot on January 6, 2021. You make the argument that what transpired that day has its genesis in the early to mid 20th century and is rooted in the independent charismatic world. Can you take us through just a brief history? This is an impossible question for a podcast, but through a brief history to the present day, who are the main characters sort of in this story?
Yeah, sure. So, we're talking about the kind of Pentecostal charismatic world, which is not always as well understood in conventional kind of evangelical or mainline Protestant circles. But we're especially focused on the non-denominational space attached to Pentecostalism that we scholars would call the independent charismatic sector of Christianity. Very rapidly growing. I mean, in 1970, the estimate is that there are about 44 million independent charismatics in the world. By 2020, the estimate is it's up to 312 million and continuing to grow, right? So this is a portion of Christianity that is roughly doubling in size. Not necessarily always by conversion, right? By new people joining Christianity, but people from other branches of Christianity are migrating towards this non-denominational charismatic space. So,
Yeah.
and this is also where a lot of Christian media is anchored. A lot of Christian worship is anchored, right? The worship industry is in some ways kind of headquartered within the independent charismatic sector. So it's very influential, not as well understood though. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book is to expose folks to some of these leaders, some of these ideas that have become so gravitational, particularly in our politics, but that aren't as well understood in kind of evangelical subculture and in the broader world, truly. So we're really focused on a movement called the New Apostolic Reformation, which has its genesis, its origins going back as far as 1948 and the Latter Rain revival in Canada. But really the story that I'm telling picks up in the 1980s around a figure named C. Peter Wagner, who is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary, actually where I went to school, my alma mater. And Wagner became convinced.
You never rubbed shoulders with Peter Wagner, huh?
No, so he retired from Fuller in 1999 to go and focus on this New Apostolic Reformation thing, and he died in 2016. I started at Fuller in 2004, and I was going very part-time, so I was there I did a 2-year degree in 7 years. It was my great success. But no, I didn't overlap with him at all. Most of his followers were basically gone by that point to really focus on this NAR approach. But some of his ideas were still very much around when I was there, and there were still courses being taught that were modeled off of courses that he had taught. So there's a lingering influence of him in that institution, but he was gone by the time I got there. And Wagner, in the late 80s, early 90s, really actually intuited this shift, this growth of the independent charismatics. He saw it happening. That was his area. His field of research was church growth and how do you produce growth. And so he's attracted to these characters, this style of Christianity that is growing very rapidly. And he started hanging out with a bunch of leaders and figures from that world. And for lack of a better term, he went native. He became convinced that not only was this the growth edge of Christianity, but that it was righteous, that it was the right thing for Christians to be focused on. And in that independent charismatic space, there was all this talk about renewing the offices of apostle and prophet, right? This idea that the church needs apostles and prophets today. We can get into all the theological background and why people think that, but it becomes this very important force in that independent charismatic space, almost a unifying factor. And Wagner said, we're going to do it. We're going to create a new cohort of apostles and prophets. We're going to call it the New Apostolic Reformation. And just about everybody who joins these networks that he starts forming, and hundreds of leaders join these networks, identifies as either an apostle or a prophet. and really looks to Wagner as kind of a leader and as their apostle. He started calling himself an apostle, right? And so he leaves Fuller in 1999 to really work on building out this NAR kind of theory and idea that he had, and it becomes hyper political and hyper fixated on taking over politics. Not only it starts out like, let's reform the church around apostles and prophets, but then over time, well, no, we not only need to reform the church, we need to conquer the world. And becomes very dedicated to this kind of right-wing political project. And then when Donald Trump hits the scene in 2015, these are some of the first Christian leaders to meet with him, some of the first Christian leaders to endorse him, and they have become, in so many ways, the Christian propaganda wing of MAGA, and have become this very, very important glue that holds together this Christian Trump coalition. And the ideas of the NAR and the leaders from these kind of Peter Wagner circles really play a central role in January 6th, a central role in selling Trump to American evangelicals. They played a central role in the 2024 campaign, and are many of the people who are the evangelical advisors who surround Trump today are either from these NAR circles or these kind of adjacent networks that have very similar agendas.
When you say conquer the world, that sounds like hyperbole, but that's pretty accurate in terms of their worldview, that Christians are essentially called to occupy the highest seats of government and other areas within society. Can you talk about the Seven Mountain mandate? And that's a big part of this NAR sort of worldview and framework.
Yeah. So starting in the 1960s, 1970s, there was a group of Calvinist theologians called the Reconstructionists. And they were very, very far right, very extreme in their theology, trying to figure out ways to change modern societies and make them conform to biblical law as they understood it. And they came up with this idea called dominion theology. It's really a framework for approaching the biblical text, the Christian Bible. And it starts Genesis 1 and goes to Revelation and really fixates on this idea from Genesis chapter 1 of the man and the woman, right? God creates the man and the woman and gives them dominion over the earth. And most Christian traditions have interpreted that as a form of stewardship, right? We're in charge of all the lesser animals and the creation itself, and God has given us a sort of stewardship. Well, the Reconstructionists say, no. The idea was for humans to have control, for righteous humans to have control over the earth. And Satan took that dominion when humanity fell, but then Jesus restored dominion through his death and resurrection. And now Christians are the ones who are the righteous humans who will take control over society, control over their fellow humans, and make the world what God wants it to be. And so these ideas kind of percolate into this charismatic space, actually quite intentionally. The Reconstructionists and the Charismatics get together in the 80s and are doing big conferences together. And there's all these different versions then of this dominion theology that get encoded with charismatic theology or charismatic prophecy. One of the major ones is really championed by the NAR, and it's called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And it's framed up by an apostle and a prophet named Lance Wallnau. Wallnau was not originally part of Wagner's networks. He was kind of doing his own thing. But then Peter Wagner hears him talking, and he claims this Seven Mountain Mandate idea is actually a prophecy. He claims that it is a revelation from God. Now, they often want to try to make it sound like it's somewhere in the Bible. They really like go and read the Seven Mountain Discourse. There's very, very little Bible in there. And where they are referencing the Bible, it's often these kind of obscure proof text kind of quotes. But the idea is you divide society up into 7 different spheres, 7 different arenas of authority: government, education, family, media, arts and entertainment, commerce, right? And the idea is each of those, they imagine it as a mountain. And the mountain, right, is directional. There's a high place that controls the mountain. And so they would say that position of control is either held by Satan and his minions or by God and the Christians. In every one of these parts of society, it's either in the control of Satan or in the control of God and Christians. And so the mandate, right, the commandment from God is for Christians to rise to positions of influence on each of the 7 mountains, to conquer that mountain, to take over that mountain, and then let Christian influence flow down into the rest of society. right? And then you'll often find this conversation about dominion, right? We need to take dominion over the seven mountains. We need to have power over the seven mountains. I'll just note, you say what you will about Jerry Falwell and James Dobson and Tony Perkins and the old religious right. I have a lot of problems with those folks. Many of them were quite scoundrels, right? But they were still playing by the rules of democracy, right? They were saying, we're the moral majority. We're the Christian coalition. If we can just get Christians voting and get them participating in democracy, then we can change society, right?
This is different.
This is different. There's not a lot of room for democracy in the Seven Mountains. And I mean, they're like, if democracy works, it's an authoritarian movement, right? It's a supremacist movement that says Christians are better than other people. Christians are entitled by God to take control over society. And if democracy helps them along the way, great. We'll use democracy. But if democracy gets in the way, then we need to overthrow democracy so that the will of God is enacted in society. Right? Mm-hmm. And so we have shifted from, and this is a big part of this cultural shift we're experiencing right now in the religious right. It has gone from, hey, we'll use the mechanisms and means of democracy to Christianize society, to Christianize society at all costs.
Yeah.
And if that means authoritarianism, if that means supporting a dictator, if that means using unethical means, hey, that's what God has willed for us to do, and we just got to do it.
What are the seven mountains?
So now you're putting me on the spot. So it's family, religion, which, right, their whole thing is like, don't stay on the religion mountain. Christians are too focused on the religion mountain, but it is one of the mountains. Government, education, arts and entertainment, media, and business and commerce. Sometimes these days they take the media and the arts and entertainment and merge that into one. And add sports and technology, which are, I don't know quite how that holds together. You know, it's somehow when God was revealing this to Lance Wallnau in 1999 or 2000, God didn't know how important the internet and sports were, and so they've had to modify the revelation, right? Because hey,
he didn't see that coming.
The number 7 is important apparently in prophecy, so we have to maintain the number 7, but we can muck around with the details where we want to.
You know, this is fascinating, Matthew, because it's like when you combine incredibly gifted, talented, you could say religious entrepreneurs, right? Gifted speakers, gifted leaders, the ability to gather a crowd and pair that with kind of a media empire and pair that with a pretty, what I would say, damaging theology. Or sociology. When you pair all that together, it's like a perfect storm, a perfect explosion of chaos. And I'm sympathetic to charismatics, Matthew, because I grew up in the Assemblies of God. The desire to see God at work in specific ways is good. No one wants to be a part of just a boring, dead religion, but there is also a problem where how much of what we see in the independent charismatic world, which is different than say the Assemblies of God or other charismatic streams. I want to make that distinction. But how much of what we see in this kind of independent charismania is an invented narrative to rescue us from the boredom of what it actually means to follow Jesus, right?
Yeah, and I want to be really clear. I am not anti-charismatic in any way. I grew up in charismatic churches. I have many friends and colleagues and peers who I respect who are charismatic. I am not opposed to the expressions of charismaticism, right? A lot of the people that I research are actually like I know, and I've become friends with people who know them, right? And so this is not some sort of a cessationist, we need to shut down charismatics and Pentecostals in the church. That is not my kind of goal at all. I am very worried about how this plays in some of these non-denominational spaces. Because by definition, to call yourself non-denominational is to say, I don't have a tradition. Right? I'm not attached to anything in the past in Christianity. And so what it has created is this kind of dynamic, energetic Wild West of Christianity, where you now have, that is, you start injecting these authoritarian and supremacist styles of theology. And truthfully, if you go back through the history of this independent charismatic space, it is a place that is highly tolerant of some very, very wild and dangerous ideas, including verging into some very aggressive forms of Christian racism. Historically, a lot of what the Christian identity movement, which is kind of the theological ideology of white supremacy today, comes out of independent charismatic spaces, right? And so again, that doesn't mean that everyone there is racist, right? It's a very multi-ethnic, complicated space, but they have a high tolerance for dangerous ideas and for dangerous leaders, because many of the leaders who are attracted into this space are the leaders who are ambitious and entrepreneurial, but who also don't want a lot of accountability. Right? Because denominations bring accountability. Denominations bring rules and bylaws and committees that are looking over your shoulder and saying, hey, how are you using all these finances that are flowing into your church or your ministry?
Exactly.
Hey, hold on a minute. You just appointed every member of your own board that oversees you, and they're all friends of yours. That's not a good situation, right? Like, there's wisdom that accumulates with tradition, but these folks are constantly reinventing the wheel. And in doing so, they have allowed a lot of very toxic ideas to flow in there. And I would actually argue that prosperity theology, which is largely an independent charismatic phenomenon today, is one of those toxic ideas that has kind of percolated up in that space and become a real force in that sector. I mean, if you could write, I focused on the NAR and Donald Trump and January 6th. You could write a whole other book about the prosperity gospel, the word of faith folks who have attached themselves to Trump, and the televangelists and these guys who are around Trump, because that's also a very important independent charismatic slice that has become deeply wound up and warped around Donald Trump.
Yeah. Well, your book kind of started talking about that with Paula White.
Yeah. She
is very much a prosperity gospel teacher and has built an empire on that theology. Mm-hmm. And it's been interesting, to see her connection to Donald Trump, and we don't have to get into all that, but it's very interesting. Matthew 11:12, right? The kingdom of God suffers violence, and the violent take it by force, the title of your book. This verse is often used as a tool for spiritual warfare, right? Inciting violence on behalf of who we deem as God's enemies. How is this verse misused? And what is its actual proper context from your research?
Sure. Yeah. So in Matthew 11, Jesus is having a conversation about his cousin, right, John the Baptist. And this is shortly before John's execution. So he's been arrested and by Herod, and Jesus is trying to kind of verbally process what has happened with his cousin, right? According to the Gospels, there's actually a relationship there, right, between Jesus and John. And so he's reflecting on the way that John is suffering, and he says, since the days of John the Baptist, right, right now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. And most Christians throughout history have read that as a kind of description of what it means to be a Christian. To be a Christian, to live by the way of God, means you're going to actually end up oftentimes like John. You're going to suffer violence.
Countercultural.
Right? And the violent people on the outside are trying to take over the kingdom of God by force. They're trying to use the power of the world to take over the kingdom of God. Right?
Mm-hmm.
In these spiritual warfare NAR circles, they read this as a mandate for spiritual violence. They say that the kingdom of heaven suffers violence from the kingdom of Satan that is trying to always take over. And the violent, the Christians, take the kingdom of heaven by force. In other words, through violent prayer, through violent activity, through violent rhetoric, through spiritual violence and battling back these demons, Christians bring about the kingdom of God. And this has become a very, very popular interpretation in Pentecostal charismatic circles. I mean, if you go and just Google the violent take it by force, you'll probably find my book, but you'll all go and put it in YouTube, right? Every week, every day, there are dozens of videos being uploaded of preachers preaching on this verse. And it's almost always Pentecostal charismatic folks. I can't remember the last time I heard a mainline Protestant preach about Matthew 11:12, but it's almost always applied to this vision of spiritual warfare. Well, in the lead up to January 6th, in this kind of aftermath of the 2020 election, these months between November of 2020 and January of 2021, I've done all this research looking at these charismatic media channels that are building towards January 6th. They're guiding people towards it. And this verse just shows up all over social media, all over the discourse. But the way they're talking about it is the kingdom of heaven, i.e., the MAGA Trump coalition and the Trump administration, and that's how wedded they become to Trump, is that
Yes.
he represents the kingdom of heaven, is suffering violence in the form of a demonic conspiracy to steal the election from Donald Trump, and the violent take it by force. In other words, we need to overthrow this demonic conspiracy, and they would even sometimes add the word back. The violent take it back by force, right?
Just add that in there.
So, it becomes a synonym in some ways of make America great again, right? The violent take it by force. That is the means to make America great again. We need to take back America using force. And again, this is where we start to get into these deeply anti-democratic sentiments because, right, their efforts are to overturn an election. I understand that they believed, and many of them sincerely believed that it had been overthrown, but what they are, or that it had been stolen from them. But what they are doing in the real world is trying to overturn the Constitution of the United States and the rule of law. That is what they are targeting their violence against. And that is what we've only seen since January 6th. That impulse has only metastasized among them. And you find this verse now on the lips of all these preachers. It's not in reference to January 6th now. It's not in reference to the stealing of the election. Now they're saying, we are going to be violent to take American culture by force.
Unbelievable. I want to read this little section of your book, Matthew. It's a little bit lengthy, but it's not too long, but I think it's important. It says, or you said, strategic level spiritual warfare, ? Layered into already roiling partisan politics, where conservative and right-wing Christians envisage their fellow citizens and often their fellow Christian as literally driven by demons. In a theological milieu where Christians believe they need to disciple whole nations as though any society is a simple monolithic whole, that is an escalating force in political polarization, and it is difficult to imagine ratcheting down. If your political opponents are literally inspired by demons, then there's no negotiating with them. Demons are not meant to be negotiated with. They are meant to be battled, exercised, and expelled. As we saw on January 6th, this rhetoric of spiritual violence stokes real-world violence. You can only proclaim that a group of people or a political party is filled with demons for so long before someone decides that those demonic vessels must actually be physically attacked. That's some sobering stuff right there.
Yeah. And again, if people believe in spiritual warfare, and it's a very popular idea in Christianity, I have many friends, again, who practice spiritual warfare. Fine, great, right? I have no objection to that when you're talking about, hey, I feel oppressed. Can you pray for me? I'll pray for myself. I'm going to sing some worship music because I'm feeling blue today. I think I might be just kind of being spiritually oppressed. I'm going to sing some worship music and restore myself. Great. If you want to use combat metaphors for that, great, right? It's when they start taking spiritual warfare and turning it into this cosmic struggle for the nation and layering the angelic forces and demonic forces onto American politics and saying the Democrats are filled with demons, and because we're with Trump, we're on the side of the angels. That is not actually the gospel, right? That is not actually what Jesus taught us about how to be in the world. And that is also a force for polarizing American politics. And it's been a very, very powerful force for polarizing American politics because, right, and you hear it in the rhetoric of these Republican and right-wing politicians and activists, where they're talking more and more about spiritual warfare, about the demonic, about the other side being filled with demons. And this, when we talk about they are demonizing people, we use this term colloquially, it is happening literally in this case.
Yeah.
right? They are
Right.
literally demonizing people and saying they are filled, the other side is filled with demons and we need to stop them. And we can't listen to them. We can't hear what they're saying because they're filled with demons. I mean, in the lead up to the 2024 election, Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountains guy, who has become one of the most prolific Trump Christian propagandists in the country, was saying on his podcast, on shows, he was saying, you know, we're getting to the point where Kamala Harris and the people on the left, we can't even listen to them anymore because they are the only thing that they are doing is giving voice to demons. Right? And Kamala Harris, who herself grew up Pentecostal, right? Who is a Christian. And whether you want to adjudicate over how good of a Christian is, she's a Christian, right?
Right.
Joe Biden is a Christian. But they are pointing to them and saying the demons are in them because we disagree with their ideas and their policies, and because we have this quasi-messiah in Donald Trump who is sponsored by God and we've got prophecies about him. I mean, that is how you get to this just lockjaw of American politics where we can't talk to each other, we can't interact with each other, and we're just at loggerheads because on one side of the spectrum, they have completely dismissed the rest of us as just the spawn of demons.
What's fascinating about your research, Matthew, is I think a lot of evangelicals see these charismatic spaces as fringe movements. That we know they're there, but they're on TV and they're asking for donations, and it's just like, let's roll our eyes at it, but it's fringe. There's not much influence there. Talk about the actual influence that these people have globally.
Yeah. So again, we're talking about the fastest growing sector of American Christianity, the fastest growing sector of global Christianity. I mean, in some ways, I think what we're seeing happening in American evangelicalism at this moment, and it's not only happening in evangelicalism, but it's really prolifically happening there, is this charismaticization of right-wing politics. And the charismatics have always been there. Right? It's always been a layer of evangelicalism, but it's always been this kind of populist layer that runs underneath the surface. These are not the elites. This is not the Colorado Springs Christianity Today crowd, right? This is not the like Christian colleges and universities crowd. This is the televangelist crowd. This is the prosperity gospel crowd. This is the prophecy conference crowd, right? And it's been kind of on the margins of American evangelicalism and of American politics for a long time. Popular, but not necessarily always in the halls of power. And what Trump has done in Republican politics as a whole is he's taken this group of fringy Republican outsiders, the Stephen Millers and Steve Bannons, and right, these people that nobody was looking to as the guiding lights of Republican politics in 2015, but he's brought them into the center and he's displaced the establishment so that the people that you or I would have said, well, what defines a Republican mainstream politician? Well, it's John McCain, it's Mitt Romney, right? Those guys aren't even Republicans anymore if they're alive, right? They've all been driven out of the party, and now it's this MAGA populism. Well, that same thing has been happening with evangelicalism. And so you had this displacement of the old guard of the religious right being replaced by people like Paula White and the NAR. And they're really, I mean, they got this ball rolling. They threw the doors open. Now it's a flood of hundreds of independent charismatic pastors, apostles, prophets, worship leaders, televangelists, revivalists, messianic rabbis, right? And they're all flooding into American politics, flooding into local politics and attempting school board takeovers, running for office, trying to get into these Trump advisory circles. I mean, there's this widespread changeover in the leadership of the religious right today. And these are the people who are driving policy now. I mean, when you look at the moves that the Trump administration, the second Trump administration has made since the inauguration to privilege Christians and to empower Christians and to go after Muslims and even a lot of the stuff that's going on around immigration and anti-Semitism, much of that is being driven by Trump's Christian advisors who are coming from these kind of dominion theology paradigms and coming from these apostle and prophet and spiritual warfare paradigms. And it has infused a second Trump administration with a Christian radicalism that I think very few of us have accounted for.
So this idea of apostles and prophets, right? So it's a biblical concept, but it seems like what has happened is incredibly problematic, where anybody can say, I am an apostle or I am a prophet and I have a direct line to God. I think of, you talk about Cindy Jacobs a lot in your book, and Dutch Sheets, and where it's like they hear special revelation from God. That's not scriptural, but it's directly to them because God has anointed them to be in this position of power and influence. And people listen to them. I mean, I was on Dutch Sheets' Instagram last week, and he's got quite a following, right? And he posts daily videos. How did we get here with this whole biblical concept of apostles and prophets to what this is?
Yeah, and this is where we go back to the mid 20th century. And in 1948, right around the same time, right? I mean, it's the kind of end of World War II, the formation of the UN, shifting global order, formation of the State of Israel. And right around that same time, this Pentecostal revival breaks out in Saskatchewan, Canada, called the New Order of the Latter Rain, often just shorthanded as the Latter Rain. And the Latter Rain folks are Pentecostal, but they see themselves as renewing Pentecostalism, right? You're 40 years in,
Yeah.
the first generations of leaders are dying. We need to renew Pentecostalism, and they become fixated on Ephesians chapter 4. And in Ephesians chapter 4, the author of Ephesians describes 5 ministry gifts that Jesus gives the church: apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And they say, well, we got evangelists, pastors, and teachers. We don't have apostles and prophets. And so we are not fulfilling the ministry of the church.
Yeah.
And then they also are Pentecostals. So they believe in prophecy, right? And so they start prophesying about these things. There is going to be a new generation at the end of time of apostles and prophets who will lead the global church into revival. This is the core idea of the latter rain. And so these ideas just get seeded into the independent charismatic space and are just kind of migrating around for decades in that space until Peter Wagner and some of these other folks in the 80s and 90s grab hold of them and then turn it into the NAR and some of these other movements.
Because this idea of revival is incredibly intoxicating.
It is. And they see themselves, I mean, one of the big prophecies in these NAR circles is about the third great awakening. And they see themselves in line with the previous awakening movements in U.S. history. And I mean, revival for them it's kind of the holy grail. It's the thing that everything becomes about revival. And so revival becomes this kind of catch-all term. And sometimes they'll combine it and pair it, and they'll talk about revival and reformation. Right? So revival in their vocabulary means this like spiritual surge in the church, right? This outpouring of the Holy Spirit that brings new people into Christianity, but that also fills existing Christians with this kind of passion, this fervor, and this drive to evangelize the world. But then Reformation, they mean changing societies, taking over societies, reforming institutions to fit their vision. So it's this very utopian, almost prophecy-driven kind of concept of the world. But the crux of it is the apostles and prophets, because they believe we've restored apostles and prophets. We've got the good leaders of the church back in place. We've got the right hierarchy. We've got the right structure. Now we can do this work. And you're right. It gives the people who make claims upon these offices of apostle and prophet are functionally saying, I outrank every pastor, every bishop. I outrank those people. And I don't have to be attached to your little piddling little church and its board. I am over these things, right? And I will note, Cheon, I have a whole chapter in my book on Cheon as a model of these kind of NAR apostles, right? Korean American apostle from Southern California, very involved in January 6th, very tied in with Trump. He has become more tied in with Donald Trump since my book came out, since January 6th. And
isn't he running for governor?
He is running for the governor of California. He just announced it like this week, right? And had the big campaign launch. He's doing it because he claimed that God revealed to him in April in a late night vision that he was supposed to run for governor of California. And Cheon is maybe one of the most influential Christians in the country. Most people have never heard of him, but he has an incredible network of churches that looked to him as their apostle, many of them centered in California. He's bringing in a volunteer base and an infrastructure that we have never seen tested in a campaign context like this. And I'm not saying he's going to win and become the governor of California or something. Who knows what happens, right? He's got a real shot, though. And I think we should not underestimate the impact of someone like Che On making this move into American politics. And I'll also note that since January 6th, this is not really in the book because I'm very focused on January 6th, but since January 6th, Che On's network of churches, especially on the West Coast, I have watched it in real time merging with the American militia movement. And you've got all these Proud Boys and other militia members who are linking up with these apostles and prophets in Che On's network, hanging out with them. People like Sean Foyt, people like Russell Johnson, people who are like ordained within Che On's network. You're seeing more and more extreme leaders migrate into that space, and more and more far-right ideologues coming into that space. So it's not just that, oh, here's Che On and he's got this church and this network and he's running for governor. He has become the charismatic godfather of the militia movement on the West Coast since January 6th, I'd argue. And he's running for California governor. And he's mainstream now. It's not that Che On has radicalized or moderated. It's that millions of Christians have moved to where Che On has been for 40 years.
Yeah. The way that you tell the story in the book, it's almost humorous. I mean, January 6th, there's nothing to laugh about that. How that threatened the very core of our democracy. But all of these leaders and their rhetoric leading up to January 6th, and then when the Capitol riot happened, Che On is in his hotel room sleeping.
Yes.
And you have different people who are there on site, but sort of detaching themselves in that moment. They essentially kind of incited a lot of the violence, but then afterwards they're sort of denouncing it.
Yes.
Right. Can you talk about who was there on January 6th?
Yeah. So I'm really focused on Peter Wagner's inner circle in the book, because once you get into the New Apostolic Reformation and all these networks, all these kind of branching groups, there are hundreds of these leaders who join Peter Wagner's network. And sometimes they get real kind of, they get real frustrated when people say, oh, you're part of the NAR, because this has become kind of this boogeyman in charismatic circles.
Yeah.
I am focused on the people who were closest to Peter Wagner, who in some ways even mentored Peter Wagner into a lot of this stuff. Che On, Cindy Jacobs, one of the most prominent charismatic prophets in the world. Dutch Sheets, who was part of Wagner's inner circle. Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountains guy. And then I also focused on Sean Foyt, who was actually was mentored by Che On and by Cindy Jacobs, and has been he's kind of the next generation in AR in some ways. And so that crew was extremely involved in January 6th. So Che On, Cindy Jacobs, Lance Wallnau were all there, along with Rebecca Greenwood, who was another member of Wagner's Inner Circle, who I feature a little bit in the book, but she's younger, so she hasn't been quite as much of a high-profile figure. And then Dutch Sheets was not physically present. He was present on January 6th through conference calls that he was having with where he's prophesying over the Capitol on speakerphone over the Capitol. But he was on a prayer call throughout the conference prayer call throughout the riot with about 4,000 intercessors on there praying basically for the success of the riot. That group is very central to the story and also central to the story of Christian Trumpism. A lot of those folks are getting quite a bit older, right? And so now you're seeing this kind of new wave of figures emerging like Sean Foyt. And that's part of why I did a whole chapter on him. So I want people to recognize, with each generation, this stuff is not dissipating. In some ways, it's radicalizing and becoming more political with each generation. And I mean, Sean Foyt was just basically kicked out of Canada for doing his shtick there. And I think we do need to really think about how do we get our hands around who the core leaders are that are emerging. And because now this stuff is beginning to merge with Turning Point USA, with other far-right networks. And it's becoming this glue that holds together a lot of the far-right movements and groups in the U.S. and creating this kind of anchor hold around Donald Trump and this kind of narrative of Trump. And I'll just note that the assassination attempts on Trump, especially the one in Butler, Pennsylvania, where the bullet nicks his ear, that just threw all these Trump prophecy narratives into hyperdrive in the campaign. And I would argue
Yeah.
that it has been one of the real factors in Trump winning in 2024. But if you listen to Trump, it has also changed him.
Yeah.
My theory, I try not to get into the political or the theological and spiritual beliefs of politicians because they're very hard to read on this front. But I actually think that Trump has started to believe that some of this stuff about these prophecies about him. And if you listen to him, he's constantly talking about God saved me to save America. God saved me to make America great again. And I've talked to people who talk to Trump. I've listened to interviews with people who talk to Trump. His personal rhetoric has shifted, and he has really started to lean into this kind of messianic conception of himself since that assassination attempt. And that is a really, really dangerous force.
Well, when you have somebody who on the narcissist spectrum leans that direction in any way, they're going to eat this stuff up. If it sort of furthers their career or their power, that's something that they're going to align with. I mean, we see that in the QAnon conspiracies, right? Where Donald Trump was never like, this is bogus. What are you talking about? He sort of has kept it alive because it, gives him a little bit of power and kind of empowers his followers, So you can kind of see how it all makes sense.
And you also, and I get into this a little bit in the book, you have to recognize that Donald Trump is a lifelong connoisseur of televangelism. That Paula White writes about this in her book about how her first conversation with Trump, he calls her up out of the blue because he saw her preaching on TV, and he's like, "You have the it factor." And this is like 2002, and her response is, "Sir, we call that the anointing." And they spend the rest of the call talking about all of Trump's favorite televangelists over the decades and what he liked about their preaching. And he's like recounting sermons to her that he heard from Jimmy Swaggart or these people that he's been watching over the years. Because he grew up in Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York, the power of positive thinking, right? This kind of mainline Protestant style prosperity gospel. And so he is very much, he's not just a collaborator. He's a consumer of their wares. And he has been, I would argue that Trump has even modeled his political career off of televangelism. And it's paid great dividends for him in both his personal fortunes and his political fortunes. But there's a kinship that's there. There's kind of a birds of a feather dynamic in the way that Trump gravitates towards these independent charismatic celebrities because they are made out of a very similar material as he is.
Yeah. Matthew, I want to shift to this idea of worship. I know you touched on it a little bit, and we'll talk about Sean Feucht in a minute, or maybe it's fitting right now. But you already described how the independent charismatic world is aligned with MAGA far-right politics, so it makes sense that the worship movement that is tied to these independent charismatic spaces, which I would say as someone in the worship world, that's the most influential worship music.
Yes.
It's not coming out of the gospel coalition. It's not coming out of reformed circles. It's coming out of the charismatic circles. Is there any other insight that you have into why worship has become so aligned with MAGA? And what do we need to watch out in that space?
I have a theory that if you really want to understand a religious community, a particular Christian religious community, look at their theology less and look at the content of their worship more. Because theology can get very formal and very technical very quick and can be very dry. And you listen to a sermon and maybe something sticks, right?
Yeah.
The hymnody, right? The songs we sing on a weekly basis, I think are more representative of the theology of the people who are present and what they're holding on to, right? The songs stick in your head, the lyrics stick in your head, the melodies stick in your head in a way, and you're maybe singing them in other places, right? They become the background music of your life. And so I think as this independent charismatic world has, especially in the US, I'd actually argue it's happening globally, has warped itself around Donald Trump and moved him into the center of their spirituality, that inevitably is going to affect their worship. You might not hear it in their sermons. You might not even hear it in like, if they have a church statement of faith, right? What we believe on their church website, you're not going to find anything about Trump there. But when you listen to the worship, when you listen to the songs they sing, and where are those songs coming from, and what is the ideology and the theology behind those songs, no, this stuff is becoming central. And I don't want to be innocent about Christianity. Right? Christianity has given us crusades. Christianity has given us inquisitions. Christianity has given us, I'd argue, the Holocaust. Christianity has given us slavery and colonialism in history. There's a lot of really dark parts of Christianity. I'd argue a lot of that has to do with Christians blending Christianity with empire. And a lot of what these folks are doing, and that still shows up not just in our worship songs, but in our old hymns, right? Where all this military imagery, this language of Christians conquering the world, of taking over, I'd argue the NAR and these modern Christian supremacists are actually much more aligned with much of Christian history than many of us want to acknowledge. Wow. And so it's not like you've got these kind of lusty old swashbuckling Protestant hymns that are all about conquering the world. And then we went through this transition and people started saying, that Constantinian Christianity, that Christendom, let's move away from that. Let's focus on more devotional aspects. Well, the Constantinian Christianity is on the upswing again, and you hear it in people's worship music. You hear it in the songs they're singing about taking over the world for Jesus. And this notion of Christian empowerment that is at the heart of the NAR, at the heart of Christian nationalism, I think is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus. Jesus came to disempower Christians, not to empower us. And if we want to turn the gospel into a quest for power, there's a long history of Christians doing that. It has devastated the world. It has bastardized Christianity, and that's what they're recreating right now.
Whew, that's a mic drop moment right there, Matthew. Has anybody brought you into a church to preach on this stuff?
I'm actually, my next book, my first two books are much more in kind of the religious studies analytical vein, and that's what The Violent Take It by Force is. I try to be as fair to these folks as I can be in that book, and really kind of maintain, here's how they present themselves, here's what they say. I've got all the footnotes. My next book is a theology book, and I am writing against Christian supremacy. And I am saying this is antithetical to the gospel. And I'm even going so far as to say, we need to reread the New Testament, especially this concept of antichrists in the New Testament. Because this term antichrist in the New Testament, we've turned it into this vague eschatological figure who's going to come and take over the world. That is not what the term means in the New Testament. It only shows up in two short New Testament texts, 1st and 2nd John. And there it's talking about Christians who abuse power and claim superiority over others. And I think we need to bring that terminology back. Because right now we are seeing an onslaught of Christians who abuse power, whether it's in the name of imperialism or in the name of building their own fiefdom and abusing people in their church. And I think we need to have a deep conversation about Christians' relationship with power and anchor ourselves once again in the gospel and say, actually, the gospel is about Christians becoming servants and denying themselves collectively and individually, and not trying to take power over society. Because every time we've tried to take power over society, that's resulted in disaster, not only for Christians, but for the rest of the world.
That's definitely the minority.
Yeah,
I'm having a lot of
tradition.
I'm having a lot of conversations with people. I would align with that. I would agree with that, and a lot of other conversations where there are people of faith, Christians, who see it less of this top-down domination and more of a bottom-up serving perspective. But what you're proposing, Matthew, is flipping the whole thing on its head, and I'm sure that's going to make a lot of people upset because it's taking away power.
Yeah.
It's taking away fame and fortune from people, and we might all be better for it if that happens.
Well, and the other thing that I'm trying to point out in the book is that Jesus and the early church were deeply countercultural, not because they were monotheists. There were other monotheists in the ancient Roman world. They were countercultural because they defied the Roman hierarchies of power, right?
Yeah,
And when Paul
that's right.
says there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, he's saying the old hierarchies of Roman society do not pertain now because the incarnation has brought dignity to all of us, but it has also equalized all of us. And so Caesar doesn't get to claim to be a god. He's just a human being, and we're not going to bow to him because we have encountered God in Jesus Christ. And so the early church was defiant of tyranny and of authoritarianism because of their anchoring in the gospel and because of the values of equality and dignity that Jesus brought. And I think that's what we need to recover, because the church has gotten in bed with empire over and over and over again, and it has only corrupted the church.
Man, so good. So much to process. I want to close with this, Matthew.
Mhm.
A little more Sean Foyt drama,
Yes.
but because this hits our world too. A lot of artists and musicians and worship leaders listen to this show. Um, in your book, you talk about how the Sean Foyt saga reveals two weaknesses in American evangelicalism. You say, well, number one, the power of charismatic experiences, right?
Mhm.
And then number two, the evangelical persecution neurosis. Can you unpack those two things?
Sure. So part of what has made these independent charismatic pastors and apostles and prophets and worship leaders like Sean Foyt and the other characters in my book, what has made them so effective in this time is that these are people who have been trained up not necessarily in a tradition of theology per se, right? They're operating in these non-denominational spaces. They're kind of cobbling together the theology. They don't go to seminary. They aren't steeped in denominations and traditions. What they have been trained in and apprenticed in is giving people powerful emotional experiences, right?
Wow.
To come up in these independent charismatic spaces, what you're trained in is generation after generation, you are apprenticed to other leaders who say, actually, here's how you do it. Here's how you get people emotional. Here's how you get people into a place where they're receptive to God. And again, as a form of spirituality, fine. People have great experiences in worship. Good, right? That's a good thing. But when you take that powerful emotional experience and link it to politics and say, hey, you've just been delivered of some demons. Hey, you have just been baptized in the Holy Spirit. You've just been slain in the Spirit. You've just heard a prophecy about your life. And by the way, Donald Trump and MAGA is God's agenda for America, right? That is going to anchor in your soul in a way that is deeper than if you just heard it in a sermon. And so what
Wow.
MAGA, what has happened as you've had this merger of charismatic spirituality and far-right populism in the Trump movement is they have figured out, they've taken this toolkit that was designed for the cultivation of people's individual spirituality and communal spirituality and leveraged it for political purposes. And it's a very, very powerful toolkit, but it's very manipulative, right? When you
And
do
you
it
could
that
say
way.
financial purposes too.
Yeah,
right?
and Sean Foyt goes around the country, goes around the world doing these big worship concerts, facilitating these experiences, but then mixing the message to say, what we really need to do is hate trans people. What we really need to do is stand against any form of government regulation, any form of government oversight of anything. And we need to stand with Donald Trump. And we, right? That emotional manipulation is very, very, very contaminating to the spirituality of the people who are actually under it. The other side of this is this kind of persecution complex that has always been an issue within evangelicalism. I mean, there's this great book by the sociologist Christian Smith. It comes out, I think, in 1898, called the title is just American Evangelicalism, but the subtitle is the really great part. It's American Evangelicalism Embattled and Thriving. right? I think it's that paradox that has been really the secret sauce of American evangelicalism, right? To say, hey, we are predominantly white, predominantly Christian kind of movement, nation. We have a lot of cultural power, but we're the persecuted ones, right? We're the ones who are on the outside of culture. Even when we control one of the political parties, even when we control both houses of the legislature, even when we control the Supreme Court, we're the persecuted ones, right? And that holds people together, right? That is a sense of communal bonding, and it's us against the world, and we're this righteous remnant that is standing against the world. And Sean Feucht and others have just become so expert at goading that and saying, hey, you're the persecuted ones. You're the ones that are on the downside. And this is the thing. If you're a Christian supremacist, you always want to present yourself as the good people or the victims, even as you're trampling on the rights of others, even as you're harming real world people, right? Then you demonize them, right? And this is what Sean Feucht has he is a master chef at baking up this kind of anger, this Christian hostility, this sense that we are the persecuted ones. And Sean Feucht, I mean, he goes into cities and does not get a permit, decides to stage his mass concert, and says deeply offensive things from the stage. And then when there's a backlash, when people are like, hey, that wasn't good. Hey, that wasn't nice. Hey, you didn't get a permit. He says, I'm persecuted, and goes on Fox News and all these right-wing media channels and gets lauded as a hero, right? And I think this is the complete opposite of how the early church understood persecution. And
Yes.
the problem with it is what we would talk about in kind of religious studies or sociology is it's a problem of you're cultivating vulnerable majorities. The majority of the US population is Christian. To claim that there is widespread persecution of Christians, of the majority of the country, 62% of the country is persecuted, BS. It is not happening. Yeah, maybe people say some offensive things about Christians. We're the majority, right? Yes,
Right.
That's what happens when you're the majority. People criticize you. But this idea of widespread anti-Christian bias, and the Trump administration has an anti-Christian bias task force being run out of the Department of Justice, trying to persecute the quote-unquote persecutors of Sean Feucht and people like him. Like, this is the way that populist movements take the religious majority, get them angry enough to keep staying with the populist authoritarian leader and supporting his every aggressive move because he's on the side of us. He's protecting the Christians as though Christians in America needed any protection.
What's fascinating about the persecution idea is you can basically do no wrong, right? If you're like an anointed prophet, you can mismanage funds, you can spiritually abuse someone, and then any sort of resistance to very human struggles and problems just cry persecution, right? You're coming against the move of God because we are on the side of God. So it shuts down any sort of conversation, right? You cover up any sort of wrongdoing. That's what I'm seeing with the Sean Feucht story. That's what's so maddening to me. Have you heard anybody in any of these spaces ever apologize or say, I'm sorry, my prophecy was wrong?
So I'll tell you two stories about that happening. Both of them will be the exceptions that prove the rule. There's a big prophet out of Bethel, and Chris Valentin co-founded Bethel with Bill Johnson. And so it's like so Bill Johnson is the apostle over Bethel. Chris Valentin is the prophet. And so he had prophesied Trump would win in 2020. And after Trump loses in November, after Trump is declared the loser, he goes on social media, records a whole video. Hey, I'm sorry. I got it wrong. I apologize. I shouldn't have said these things. It was right. He got such backlash that he retracted his retraction and said, hey, actually the election's not resolved yet. And so if Joe Biden gets inaugurated, then I'll apologize for real. The other one.
So even his followers were saying, don't apologize.
Absolutely.
Because they're so radicalized and indoctrinated.
Well, and you got hundreds of other
ideology.
prophets who are all still singing in chorus. He's the off note. He needs to be put back in line. The other one that's even scarier is this guy, Jeremiah Johnson. Jeremiah Johnson was maybe the first of the Trump prophets. He predates Wall now with this Cyrus prophecy. And he was with Trump. 2016, 2020, prophesied Trump would win in 2020. After January 6th, Jeremiah Johnson came forward and said, I'm sorry. I got it wrong. My prophecies contributed to this mess, and I apologize. He got death threats from his followers.
Wow.
Driven out of ministry temporarily because they said, how dare you betray the word of God that was given to you? Now, here's the crazy thing, right? He's back at it. He is still playing the prophet thing. He is still doing Trump prophecies. And it's even created this fracture in his family. His brother, who was working with him in ministry up until 2020, has denounced him as a false prophet. So, you want to talk about wolves in sheep's clothing. These people fit Jesus' description to a T.
That is fascinating. It's almost like they're so good at it. And they can create such a fortune from it that the thought of going to work at Costco is impossible to consider.
And for many of them, this is all they've ever known, right? They've grown up in these movements. They've been mentored and apprenticed in this. They don't know how to do anything else other than be a celebrity prophet. And they're good at it, right? And you can make money doing it, and you can get this huge following, and you can have all these friends with power, and you might get invited to the White, right? The incentive structure is completely aligned to draw in the wolves, and it has.
Yeah. Matthew, this has been unbelievable. I feel like you've just turned lights on in all these dark corners of Christianity and of evangelicalism. And brought some clarity and understanding to what we're seeing. I'm not naive. I know this conversation is going to make a lot of people angry. Maybe some of them have already turned off and are not going to listen to the end of this. But this is important stuff, right? To be able to look at this, not just with kind of prophetic spiritual eyes, but very natural eyes to know what is going on and to be wide awake to what is happening in our country and in the church. So, before we leave, Matthew, what would you leave us with? Where do we go from here? Any sort of word of wisdom or challenge or encouragement to the church that wants to do things a different way?
American democracy and American society is in a very bad place today, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We have an authoritarian leader, a wannabe dictator, who is rapidly consolidating power, who is defying the rule of law, who is riding roughshod over the other branches of our government, and who has this lock kind of attachment of a lot of Christians in America who have built their spirituality, have reconfigured their spirituality around Donald Trump in the last decade. So we're in a bad spot. Christians have been in bad spots before, and I would argue that the best elements of Christianity come where Christianity is lived from the margins and resisting tyranny. And this is an opportunity for those of us. And I'll also say, a lot of what is holding Trump in power right now is theological propaganda catered to Christians, being driven by people like the NAR and Paula White and Sean Foyt. If the propaganda is theological, our response to it must be theological, because we need to speak to our fellow Christians, and we need to have a big town hall in American Christianity, and we need to have some honest arguments, and we need to have some theological fights, and we need to say, hey, you know what? Look, I recognize these people as fellow Christians. I am not saying they are not Christians, right? They're part of my family. That means that I have a certain responsibility for speaking out against them and for saying, this is wrong. You are betraying the gospel of Jesus Christ. You are bastardizing the message of Jesus. You are putting the church in bed with a tyrant. We need to speak out about that. And I don't claim like I'm the leader of the movement. Come follow me. No. We need a chorus of voices to counter their chorus of voices. Yeah. A diverse chorus of voices from a whole bunch of different traditions, from a whole bunch of different theological backgrounds to say, hey, look, we can have a lot of other conversations about theology and which style of worship is better, fine, whatever. Have those fights. This is the fight of our time. The theological fight of our time is the abuse of power and the rise of Christian supremacy. And I think Christians of good faith need to unite across traditions to say, this is not worthy of the gospel of Christ. And these false prophets and these wolves in sheep's clothing are destroying the gospel in our time, and we need to stand against it.
Matthew, you probably don't consider yourself a prophet, even considering that term is probably like, don't even bring me into that world. But what I would say is what you're saying to me is more of a prophetic word to the church than what we're hearing in these prophetic movements.
Well, if it's in the vein of the Hebrew prophets, I'll take it.
Exactly. Well, the book is The Violent Take It by Force, Matthew D. Taylor. I just got to say, like, I loved this book. I devoured it. It's pretty dense. It's got so many details, and I honestly couldn't put it down, like I said before we hit record, because I've grown up sort of orbiting these different spaces, and it's highly entertaining, historical, informational. So I'd encourage all of you listening, The Violent Take It by Force. And Matthew, we will look forward to your new book. Is that like releasing maybe 2026?
October 26th.
Okay. So in about a year or so.
Finishing up the
we'll look
manuscript
forward
now.
to that. Yes, amazing. Matthew, again, thank you for taking some time today to educate us, to talk with us. We're so grateful for you and your work. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.